A golden retriever refused to move in a storm. When the police lifted him, the whole town froze. The storm had swallowed the whole town. Rain hammered the streets in sheets, blurring windows and turning familiar roads into shallow rivers. Most people had retreated indoors when the traffic stopped, not because of flooding or downed power lines, but because of a dog. A golden retriever lay in the middle of the intersection, soaked, shivering and refusing to move. Cars idled with engines running, horns blared, then fell silent. Drivers stepped out beneath umbrellas, staring as the dog pressed himself low against the wet asphalt, eyes fixed downward. No matter how many voices called or hands reached toward him, he would not budge. When the police arrived, they even paused. Officer Mason crouched in the rain, expecting injury or panic. Instead, he saw something else in the animal's eyes: determination. The unmistakable kind that comes not from fear, but from purpose. Beneath the dog's body lay a red wallet, waterlogged, frayed at the edges, clamped shut as though someone had deliberately left it behind. Mason opened it carefully. Inside was an ID he recognized. A man who had left for work that morning and never made it to the office. The town assumed the storm had claimed him, but the dog seemed to know differently. Thunder rumbled overhead as rain poured harder. The retriever lowered his head over the wallet and released a soft, desperate whine, not of pain, but of insistence. He wasn't lost. He was keeping watch over the only clue to someone who might still be out there, and he would not leave until someone understood. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Let's begin. The storm arrived without ceremony. It had been forecast for days, but no one truly believed it would hit as hard as the meteorologists warned. By mid-morning, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, and the wind began to pick up, rattling shop signs and sending trash cans tumbling down empty streets. By noon, the first drops fell, fat and cold, smacking against windshields and pavement with surprising force. Within an hour, the town was unrecognizable. Rain came in waves, each one heavier than the last, drumming against rooftops and overwhelming gutters that hadn't been cleared in years. Water pooled at intersections, crept up curbs, and swallowed storm drains whole. The few people still outside moved quickly, heads down, clutching coats and bags as they hurried toward shelter. Storefronts went dark one by one as owners locked up early, flipping signs to closed and peering out through fogged glass at the deluge. Traffic slowed to a crawl. Headlights cut pale beams through the downpour, barely reaching 10 feet ahead. Wipers worked furiously and uselessly. Drivers leaned forward, squinting, gripping steering wheels with white knuckles as they navigated streets that longer looked like streets. The town's usual rhythm, the hum of voices, the clatter of footsteps, the distant bark of a dog or child, was drowned beneath the roar of water and wind. It was the kind of storm that swallowed sound, that made the world feel smaller and more dangerous, the kind that reminded people how fragile their routines really were. At the elementary school, dismissal was delayed. Parents idled in the parking lot, engines running, watching sheets of rain slam sideways across the blacktop. At the grocery store, the last few customers stood near the entrance, waiting for a break in the weather that wouldn't come. At the fire station, radios crackled with reports of minor flooding, fallen branches, and a car stalled on the bypass. Nothing catastrophic yet, just inconvenient, just unsettling. But the storm wasn't finished. By early afternoon, the power started flickering. Lights dimmed, stuttered, and in some neighborhoods it went out entirely. The wind howled louder now, bending trees at unnatural angles and tearing loose shingles from older homes. Thunder rolled in from the west, deep and constant, vibrating through walls and windows. People called loved ones to check in.
"Are you home? Are you safe? Did you make it?" Most had, but not everyone. And as the storm deepened and the town hunkered down, somewhere in the chaos, a man left for work and vanished. Somewhere in the rain, a dog waited. And somewhere beneath the noise and water and the wind, a story was beginning that no one had seen coming. The storm had only just arrived. The first car to stop was a silver sedan driven by a woman on her way home from the hospital. She had been inching through the rain, barely able to see past her hood, when she spotted the shape in the middle of the intersection. At first, she thought it was debris, maybe a tarp or a bag of trash caught in the current. But as she rolled closer, the shape moved, just slightly. A lift of the head, a shift of weight. A dog. She hit the brakes and sat there, engine idling, wipers scraping uselessly across the windshield. The dog didn't run, didn't even flinch. It just lay there, stretched low against the pavement, head down as rain poured over its back in rivulets. Behind her, another car pulled up. Then another. Within minutes, the intersection was blocked. Drivers leaned forward, peering through fogged glass, trying to understand what they were seeing. A few tapped their horns, short, uncertain honks that echoed dully in the storm. The dog didn't react. The woman in the sedan unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit her immediately, soaking through her jacket before she'd even closed the door. She raised a hand to shield her eyes and moved toward the dog, calling out softly, "Hey, buddy. Hey, it's okay." The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. She crouched a few feet away, rain dripping from her hair, and tried again. "Come on, sweetheart, you can't stay here." Nothing. By now, others had emerged from their cars. A man in a delivery uniform, a teenager with a backpack slung over one shoulder, an older woman clutching an umbrella that the wind kept trying to rip from her hands. They formed a loose half-circle around the dog, murmuring to one another, unsure what to do. Is he hurt? Maybe he got hit. Should we call someone? The woman from the sedan reached out slowly, fingers extended, but the dog pulled his body tighter against the asphalt and let out a low, vibrating growl, not aggressive, but unmistakable, a warning. She pulled her hand back. "He's protecting something," the delivery driver said, squinting through the rain. Protecting what? No one had an answer. More cars arrived, more people gathered. Some stayed in their vehicles, watching through rain-streaked windows. Others stood in the downpour, arms crossed, faces tight with concern or confusion. A few tried coaxing the dog with gentle words or outstretched hands, but each time the result was the same. The dog would not move. Traffic backed up in all directions now. Horns blared farther down the street, drivers unaware of the cause. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Someone else called the police. And through it all, the golden retriever lay motionless in the center of the road, drenched and shaking, his dark eyes fixed on whatever lay beneath him. His breathing was shallow, his body tense, but his resolve was absolute. He wasn't confused, he wasn't lost, he was exactly where he needed to be, and he wasn't leaving. Officer Mason arrived in a patrol car with lights flashing but no siren. He'd taken the call expecting a simple animal control situation, a stray blocking traffic, maybe injured, probably disoriented by the storm. Nothing unusual, nothing that required more than a few minutes and a gentle hand. But as he pulled up to the intersection and saw the crowd gathered in the rain, something in his chest tightened. This wasn't simple. He stepped out into the downpour, tugging his cap lower, and made his way through the cluster of onlookers. They parted without a word, eyes following him as he approached the dog. Rain hammered his shoulders, water ran down the back of his neck. He barely noticed. The golden retriever lay in the center of the road, soaked to the bone, trembling visibly. His fur was plastered flat against his ribs, and his paws were splayed protectively over something Mason couldn't yet see. The dog's eyes flicked up as Mason drew closer, not with fear, but with watchfulness, awareness. Mason had been a cop for 12 years. He'd seen plenty of animals in distress.
Injured dogs that snapped out of pain, frightened ones that bolted the moment you got close, aggressive ones that had to be handled with caution and distance. This wasn't any of those. He lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the cold water that soaked through his uniform pants, and spoke quietly. "Easy, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's ears swiveled toward him, but his body didn't move. His breathing was quick and shallow, visible in the rise and fall of his ribs. Mason reached out slowly, palm open, letting the dog see his hand. The growl that followed was soft but firm, not a threat, a boundary. He stopped. He'd expected panic or pain. He'd expected the wild, reactive energy of an animal that didn't understand what was happening to it. But this dog understood perfectly. There was intelligence in those eyes, focus, something that looked almost human. Inside was a driver's license behind a clouded plastic window. Mason leaned closer, squinting through the rain, and his stomach dropped. The face staring back at him from the license was one he knew. David Brennan. 42 years old, brown hair, blue eyes, address listed on Maple Avenue, just 3 blocks from the station. Mason had seen him around town plenty of times, at the diner on Sunday mornings, at the gas station, walking this same golden retriever on clear evenings when the weather was kind. David was quiet, kept to himself mostly, worked as a maintenance supervisor at the old textile plant on the east side. Mason didn't know him well, but he knew him enough. And he knew David was missing. The report had come in earlier that morning. His supervisor had called it in after he didn't show up for his shift. Unusual for someone who hadn't missed a day in 3 years. His truck was gone. His phone went straight to voicemail. His house was locked up tight, lights off, no sign of struggle. At the time, Mason and the other officers had assumed he'd taken shelter somewhere and couldn't get through. The storm had knocked out cell towers, roads were flooded. It wasn't uncommon for people to hunker down and wait it out. But now, holding this wallet in his hands, Mason felt the weight of something else entirely. He looked back at the dog. The retriever sat upright now, still trembling from cold, but no longer pressed flat against the pavement. His eyes were fixed on Mason with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Mason's neck stand up. "Where is he?" Mason asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. The dog whined, low and aching, the sound of something desperate trying to be heard. Mason's throat tightened. David hadn't just disappeared. He'd left this behind, or dropped it, or worse. And this dog, this loyal, soaked, shivering animal, had found it, had stayed with it, had refused to abandon the only trace of his owner left in the world. Mason stood slowly, wallet in hand, and looked out at the crowd. "We've got a missing person," he said.
David Brennan had left his house at 6:30 that morning, same as he did every weekday. He'd brewed coffee in the same chipped mug he'd used for a decade, fed Cooper, the golden retriever now lying in the rain, and grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. His ex-wife had taken most of the furniture when she left 2 years ago, but she'd let him keep the dog. It was the one thing David had fought for. He worked the early shift at the textile plant, overseeing a crew of 12 who maintained the aging machinery that kept the place running. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and David was good at it, reliable. The kind of man who showed up on time, did the job, and went home without fuss. His supervisor, Frank Ochoa, had called the police at 8:15 when David didn't clock in. "He's never late," Frank had told the dispatcher, his voice tight with concern. "Not once in 3 years. Something's wrong." Officers had driven by David's house first. The small ranch-style home on Maple Avenue sat dark and quiet, the driveway empty. His truck, a faded blue Ford with a dent in the passenger door, was gone. Neighbors hadn't seen him leave, but that wasn't unusual. David kept to himself. He worked, he came home, he walked his dog. That was the routine. His daughter, Emma, lived 2 hours away in the city. She was 19, a sophomore in college, and spoke to her father every Sunday like clockwork. She'd called him the night before the storm, and he'd sounded fine. Tired, maybe, but fine. He said he'd be careful driving in the rain, she told the officer who contacted her, her voice breaking. He promised he'd text me when he got to work. He never did. David's phone had gone dead sometime around 7 that morning. The last ping from his cell tower placed him heading east on Route 9, the two-lane road that connected the residential part of town to the industrial area where the plant sat. It was a route he'd driven 1,000 times. He could have done it in his sleep. But somewhere between his house and the plant, David Brennan had vanished. His truck hadn't been found. There were no reports of accidents, no calls about vehicles in distress. The storm had been building, yes, but it hadn't hit full force until after 8. He should have made it. The officers had filed the report, flagged his vehicle, and assumed he'd turn up once the weather cleared. People got stranded in storms. They pulled over to wait it out. They lost signal and couldn't call for help. It happened. But now, standing in the rain with David's wallet in his hand and David's dog refusing to leave the intersection, Mason knew this was different. David hadn't pulled over. He hadn't decided to wait out the storm. Something had happened to him. And Cooper, loyal, stubborn, soaking wet Cooper, had been trying to tell someone from the very beginning. Mason looked down at the dog, and the dog looked back. "Show me," Mason said quietly. Cooper stood, shook once, and turned toward the east, toward Route 9. Cooper didn't run. He moved with deliberate slowness, head low, shoulders tight, each step measured as though he were checking to see if Mason was following. He paused at the edge of the intersection, glanced back, and waited. Mason turned to his partner, Officer Yates, who had just arrived in a second patrol car. "Get animal control on standby, but don't bring him in yet, and clear this intersection, get traffic rerouted." Yates nodded, already pulling out his radio. Mason looked back at Cooper. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't lost focus. His eyes were locked on Mason with an intensity that was unnerving. This wasn't the aimless wandering of a lost pet. This was intention. "All right, boy, let's go." Cooper turned and started walking east. The crowd murmured behind them. A few people called out, offering to help, asking what was happening, but Mason waved them back. He didn't know what this was yet, but he knew it needed space. He needed to see where the dog would lead him. They moved through the rain together, Cooper a few paces ahead, Mason trailing close behind. The dog's gait was uneven now that Mason could see him in motion. He favored his right hind leg slightly, and his breathing came hard and fast. He'd been out in this storm for hours, maybe longer. He should have been exhausted, should have been looking for shelter. But he didn't stop. They reached the corner of Elm and Route 9, and Cooper paused again. He sniffed the ground, circled once, then sat. His eyes lifted to Mason, and he let out a single sharp bark. Mason crouched beside him. "What is it?" The dog nosed toward the curb. Mason followed his gaze and saw it. A skid mark, faint but visible even in the rain. Fresh, the kind left by tires locking up suddenly. Mason's pulse quickened. He stood and scanned the area. Route 9 stretched ahead, slick and empty. To the right, a drainage ditch ran parallel to the road, swollen with runoff. To the left, a steep embankment sloped down into a wooded area that most people avoided. Cooper was already moving again, veering toward the embankment. "Wait!" Mason started, but the dog didn't wait. He descended carefully, paws slipping slightly on the wet grass, and disappeared over the edge. Mason swore under his breath and followed. The slope was steeper than it looked. He half slid, half walked down, grabbing at exposed roots and low branches to keep his balance. Rain poured harder now, turning the ground into mud. His boots sank with every step. At the bottom, Cooper stood in a clearing, water pooling around his paws. He was staring at something. Mason pushed through the underbrush and stopped cold. 20 feet ahead, nose down in a shallow ravine, was a blue Ford truck. The driver's side door hung open, the windshield cracked, the front end crumpled against a tree. And inside, no one. Cooper barked again, sharper this time, and bolted past the truck, deeper into the trees. Mason's heart hammered. He pulled his radio from his belt.
"This is Mason. I've found Brennan's vehicle. Route 9, east side, down the embankment past Elm. No sign of the driver." He paused, watching Cooper vanish into the shadows. "I'm going after the dog." Cooper didn't look back this time. He moved through the trees with sudden urgency, weaving between trunks and ducking under low branches, his body low to the ground. Mason struggled to keep up. The terrain was unforgiving. Roots jutted out at odd angles, mud sucked at his boots, and the rain turned everything into a blur of green and gray. But he didn't lose sight of the dog. Cooper's pale coat stood out against the dark woods, a flash of gold moving with purpose through the storm. Every few seconds he would pause, nose to the ground, then adjust his path slightly and continue. He wasn't wandering, he was tracking. Mason's radio crackled. Yates' voice came through, distorted with static. "Mason, you copy? Backup's en route. ETA is 5 minutes." "Copy," Mason said, breathless. "Tell them to follow my path down the embankment. I'm heading southeast into the woods." "What have you got?" Mason didn't answer right away. He didn't know yet. All he had was a wrecked truck, a missing man, and a dog that seemed to know exactly where he was going. "Just get here," Mason said, and clipped the radio back to his belt. Ahead, Cooper stopped. Mason caught up, breathing hard, and found the dog standing at the edge of a narrow creek. The water was high, moving fast, filled with debris from upstream, branches, leaves, pieces of trash, all of it rushing past in a muddy torrent. Cooper stared across to the other side. Mason followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing, just more trees, more rain. But then through the downpour he caught the glimpse of something that didn't belong. A shape, dark and low to the ground, not moving. Mason's stomach clenched. "David?" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the water. No response. Cooper barked 3 sharp, desperate sounds and stepped into the creek. "No, wait!" Mason lunged forward, grabbing for the dog's collar, but Cooper was already in the water, paddling hard against the current. His head barely stayed above the surface. The current pulled at him, dragging him downstream, but he fought it, legs churning, eyes fixed on the opposite bank. Mason swore and waded in after him. The cold hit him like a fist. The water was deeper than it looked, already up to his thighs, and the current was stronger than he had anticipated. He braced himself against the flow, boots slipping on the rocky bottom, and pushed forward. Cooper reached the other side first, scrambling up the bank with muddy paws and bolted toward the dark shape. Mason hauled himself out of the water and ran. As he closed the distance, the shape came into focus. A man, lying on his side beneath a fallen tree, soaked, motionless. Cooper reached him first and nosed his face, whining. Mason dropped to his knees beside them, rain pouring down, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. There. Faint, slow, but there. A pulse. "David?" Mason breathed. "David, can you hear me?" David Brennan's eyes fluttered but didn't open. His skin was pale, his lips tinged blue. Blood matted his hair on one side. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. But he was alive. Cooper settled beside him, pressing his body close, and rested his head on David's chest. Mason pulled his radio with shaking hands. "I've got him." The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. Mason stayed with David, checking his breathing, trying to keep him conscious, while Cooper refused to move from his side. The dog's body heat was minimal, but he pressed close anyway, as if willing warmth into the man who'd been lying in the cold rain for who knew how long. "Stay with me, David," Mason said, his hand on the man's shoulder. "Help's coming. You're gonna be okay." David's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his eyes opened, just barely, unfocused and glassy, and his hand twitched, reaching for something. Mason caught it, squeezed it. "It's okay, we've got you." But David shook his head weakly, his mouth forming a word Mason couldn't hear over the rain. Mason leaned closer. "What? What is it?" "Bridge," David whispered, the word barely audible. "Bridge, going to—" His eyes rolled back, and he went still again. Mason's blood ran cold. He pulled out his radio. "Yates, where's the nearest bridge from my position?" Static crackled. Then, Miller's Crossing, about half a mile downstream from you. Why?" Mason's mind raced. Miller's Crossing was an old single-lane bridge that spanned the creek where it widened into a shallow river. It was narrow, built decades ago, and served as the primary route between the east and west sides of town. During the storm, it would be one of the few roads still passable. Or it was supposed to be. "Brennan just said something about a bridge," Mason said, his voice tight. "Get someone over there now."
Mason, we've got search and rescue en route to your location. I don't care. Get someone to Miller's Crossing and shut it down. I think something's wrong with it." There was a pause, then Yates' voice came back sharper now. "Copy that. Dispatching units." The paramedics crashed through the underbrush moments later, equipment in hand. Mason stepped back to give them room, watching as they worked quickly, checking vitals, stabilizing David's leg, loading him on a backboard. Cooper hovered close, whining until one of the medics gently nudged him aside. "He's hypothermic and has a head injury, possible internal bleeding. We need to move fast." They lifted David and started back toward the embankment. Cooper tried to follow, but his legs buckled. He collapsed on his side, breathing hard. Mason knelt beside him. "Easy, boy, easy." The dog's eyes were half closed now, exhaustion finally overtaking him. Mason scooped him up. He was heavier than he looked, waterlogged and limped, and carried him back through the trees. By the time they reached the road, Mason's radio erupted with voices. "All units, this is dispatch. Miller's Crossing bridge is compromised. Repeat, bridge is compromised. Foundation collapse on the north support. Evacuation in progress." Mason stopped cold.
Yates' voice cut through. "Mason, they're saying the bridge could go any minute. There are cars on it. We're trying to clear them now." Mason looked down at the dog in his arms, then back toward the woods where David had been lying. David had tried to warn them. He'd crashed, trying to get back, trying to tell someone. And Cooper had understood. The dog hadn't just been guarding a wallet. He'd been guarding a message. They evacuated Miller's Crossing just in time. 17 cars had been on the bridge when the first cracks appeared, hairline fractures, spiderwebbing across the concrete, pieces of the support structure crumbling into the swollen water below. Officers waved drivers back, redirecting traffic with urgent voices and flashing lights. The last vehicle cleared the span just as the north pylon gave way with a groan that echoed through the valley. The bridge sagged, held, then collapsed in sections, concrete and steel folding into the water like paper. No one was hurt. By the time Mason made it back to the station, the story had already started to piece itself together. David Brennan had been driving to work that morning when he'd noticed something wrong with the bridge. He worked maintenance, he knew structures, knew how water could undermine foundations, knew what stress fractures looked like. He'd crossed Miller's Crossing hundreds of times, and that morning, in the early light with rain already starting to fall, he'd seen it. The erosion, the shift in the support beams, the way the whole thing sat just a little lower than it should have. He'd turned his truck around. He was heading back to the station, to the plant, to anyone who would listen, when he'd lost control on the wet road. The truck had skidded, gone off the embankment and slammed into the tree. The impact had thrown him from the vehicle. He'd tried to crawl, tried to get back to the road, but his leg was broken and his head was bleeding, and the rain kept coming. Somewhere in the chaos, his wallet had fallen, and Cooper, loyal, stubborn Cooper, had been in the truck with him. The god had survived the crash without serious injury. He could have run, could have found shelter, could have saved himself, but he didn't. He'd found the wallet, he'd carried it in his mouth back to the road, back to where people might see it, might stop, might understand, and when no one came, he'd stayed. He'd laid his body over the only proof that David Brennan had been there, the only clue that something had gone terribly wrong. He'd refused to move, even as the storm worsened, even as cars honked and people shouted, even as hours passed and the cold sank deeper into his bones, because David was still out there, and someone needed to find him. Mason stood in the hospital hallway, looking through the window into David's room. The man was asleep, bandaged and hooked up to monitors, but stable. The doctor said he'd been minutes from hypothermia turning critical. Another hour in the rain and he wouldn't have made it. Beside Mason, Cooper lay curled on a borrowed blanket, wrapped in a towel, finally warm. A vet had checked him over. Dehydration, mild hypothermia, exhaustion. Nothing that rest and food wouldn't fix. The dog's eyes were closed, but his breathing was steady. Mason crouched down and rested a hand on Cooper's head. "You did good, boy," he said quietly. "You saved him." Cooper's tail thumped once against the floor, and for the first time all day, he let himself sleep. Because his job was done, David was safe, and Cooper had never left him behind. Thank you for staying with us till the end of this story. I'm sure you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to get more interesting videos like this.